The courtroom was hushed, a silent cathedral of law and order, its towering walls bearing witness to the thousands of verdicts that had been handed down over the years. The air inside was thick with a solemn weight, an invisible force that made even the most confident attorneys straighten their backs and measure their words. For Pam Bondi, however, this was more than just another case. It was a moment that could shift the very foundation of the justice system she had spent her entire career defending. Sunlight streamed through the high, arched windows, illuminating the wooden benches where members of the press sat poised with notepads and recording devices, eager to catch every word. Behind them, a restless audience filled the gallery, citizens who had come to see whether the whispers of corruption would finally be dragged into the light. At the center of it all sat Judge Randall Whitmore, a man whose reputation had long been wrapped in an impenetrable cloak of authority. He had presided over some of the most high-profile cases in the state, delivering rulings with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. His robes, dark as the shadows lurking in his past, draped over his frame like the armor of a warlord, his gavel resting on the bench like a weapon ready to strike. Pam Bondi, her blonde hair swept into a no-nonsense chignon, stood tall at the prosecution table. There was a steely resolve in her eyes, a quiet but unshakable fire that had made her one of the most formidable legal minds in the country. She had fought battles before, against corruption, against injustice, but this was different. This was personal. She scanned the room, her gaze settling on the jury. 12 men and women who had been carefully selected, each one holding the power to deliver a verdict that would send shockwaves through the entire judicial system. Some of them avoided her stare, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Others watched her intently, waiting for the truth they had been promised. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat, his voice echoing through the chamber like a low growl. "Ms. Bondi, you may proceed." She took a measured breath, stepping toward the jury box with the confidence of a woman who had long since learned that fear had no place in a courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying a crisp clarity that cut through the room's tension like a scalpel. "We are gathered here today not just to prosecute a case, but to determine whether justice itself still holds meaning in this courtroom." A murmur rippled through the audience, a wave of anticipation that passed from row to row like an electric current. For years, Judge Randall Whitmore has sat in that chair, wearing those robes, wielding that gavel with an air of absolute authority. She continued, pacing slowly. His rulings have shaped lives. His decisions have defined futures. But behind the veil of judicial power, there exists a truth that has been buried for far too long. Pam paused, letting her words settle. She turned slightly, meeting the cold, calculating gaze of the man she had spent months investigating. Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers curling ever so slightly around the gavel. Bribes, case manipulation, the deliberate sentencing of innocent people to serve his own financial and political interests, she said, each word punctuated with precision. These are not accusations made lightly. They are facts, supported by evidence that will leave no room for doubt. The judge scoffed, leaning forward slightly. "Ms. Bondi, I would remind you to. You will remain silent," she interrupted, her voice like iron. "Today, Judge Whitmore, you are not the law. You are the accused." A collective gasp rippled through the chamber, and for the first time in his long, untouchable career, Randall Whitmore looked unsettled. Pam turned back to the jury, allowing the weight of her words to hang in the air. She could see the shift in their expressions, some wide-eyed, others stone-faced, but all leaning in, caught in the gravity of the moment. This case is not about political games or personal vendettas. It is about the victims, innocent men and women whose lives were destroyed because they trusted the system to protect them, she said, her voice steady but filled with unmistakable emotion. It is about those who sat in that very chair, believing they had a fair chance, only to discover that their fate had been decided before they ever spoke a word. She reached for a folder on the table, flipping it open and pulling out a series of documents. With careful precision, she lifted the first page. This is a financial transaction linking Judge Whitmore to an offshore account, one that received a seven-figure deposit just days before he overturned a conviction against a powerful corporate executive. She moved to the next page. This is an email exchange where he assured a political ally that their legal troubles would disappear in exchange for campaign funding. One by one, she laid the documents before the jury, each piece of evidence another stone in the mountain of corruption. And finally, she said, turning toward the back of the courtroom, "We have a witness." The doors swung open, and the entire room seemed to inhale at once. A man, thin and worn, his suit slightly oversized, stepped forward with hesitant but determined steps. His face was familiar to many, an attorney who had once worked closely with Whitmore before disappearing from the public eye. "I call to the stand Robert Hastings," Pam announced, "a man who once stood by Judge Whitmore's side, but can no longer remain silent." The color drained from Whitmore's face. His grip on the gavel tightened, but there was no power left in it. The truth had begun its slow, merciless march forward, and he could do nothing to stop it. Pam stepped back, her pulse steady, her heart unshaken. She had spent months preparing for this moment. Now, the wheels of justice were in motion, and nothing, not power, not influence, not even the might of the system itself, would stop the truth from being heard. This was only the beginning, and by the time the day was over, justice would no longer be a whisper in the dark. It would be a roar that no one could ignore. The silence in the courtroom had deepened, thickened, taken on a weight of its own, pressing down on the spectators like an invisible force. Every pair of eyes remained locked on Robert Hastings, the former legal confidant of Judge Randall Whitmore, as he made his way toward the witness stand. His footsteps echoed against the polished floors, each step a quiet declaration that the truth was no longer willing to be buried beneath the suffocating weight of corruption. Pam Bondi stood motionless, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the prosecution's table, her sharp gaze fixed on Hastings. She had spent months searching for him, tracing the faintest whispers of his whereabouts through the legal underground, piecing together the fragments of his story from documents that had been meant to disappear. Now, at long last, he was here, standing before the very system that had nearly destroyed him, prepared to expose the man who had once held unchecked power over justice itself. Judge Whitmore's fingers curled against the armrests of his towering chair, his knuckles turning pale beneath the thick fabric of his robe. A muscle in his jaw twitched, his expression a carefully measured blend of disdain and forced composure. For years, he had been untouchable, a fortress of authority and influence, protected by the very laws he had twisted to serve his own ends. But today, that fortress had begun to crack, and with every word that Robert Hastings was about to speak, another stone would crumble. Hastings settled into the witness chair, his breath steady but deliberate, his fingers tightening around the wooden railing as if anchoring himself to the moment. His face bore the weary lines of a man who had once believed in the purity of the law, only to learn the hard way that not all men who sat behind the bench were worthy of the power entrusted to them. Pam stepped forward, her heels clicking against the floor, the rhythmic sound punctuating the heavy stillness that hung in the air. She paused beside the jury box, her hands folded in front of her, her voice calm but laced with the kind of quiet conviction that left no room for doubt. "Mr. Hastings," she began, her tone neither rushed nor hesitant, "you once served as the lead clerk under Judge Whitmore's tenure. Can you tell the jury why you left?" Hastings swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly, the weight of memory flickering behind his tired eyes. His voice, though steady, carried the remnants of a man who had spent years in silence, wrestling with the ghosts of decisions he could never undo. "I left," he said, exhaling slowly, "because I could no longer be part of something I knew was wrong." The gallery stirred, the restrained murmurs of onlookers rippling through the room like a rising tide. The judge shifted slightly, adjusting his robe as if the very fabric had begun to itch against his skin. Pam nodded, allowing the weight of the moment to settle before continuing. "When you say wrong, Mr. Hastings, can you clarify what you mean?" What exactly did you witness? Hastings turned slightly, his gaze moving past the jurors, past the reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads, past the rows of strangers who had gathered to witness a reckoning long overdue. His focus landed on Whitmore, the man who had once commanded every room he entered, the man who had orchestrated fates with the casual flick of a gavel. I witnessed cases where verdicts had been decided before arguments were even made, Hastings said, his voice growing stronger. I saw men and women walk into this courtroom believing they would be heard, only to have their lives traded away like bargaining chips. A murmur of disbelief swept through the crowd, though for some, it was not disbelief at all, only the grim confirmation of suspicions that had festered for years. Pam took a slow step forward, her voice unwavering, measured. Are you saying that Judge Whitmore accepted bribes in exchange for favorable rulings? Hastings nodded, his grip tightening on the wooden rail before him. Not just bribes, he said, his tone edged with something raw, something bitter. Political favors, financial incentives, even pressure from corporate interests who had no place influencing the justice system. Judge Whitmore let out a quiet scoff, shifting in his chair as if suddenly aware that the walls around him were beginning to close in. His gaze flicked toward the defense attorney seated beside him. But even his legal counsel remained uncharacteristically still, his fingers tapping nervously against the table as though contemplating the fastest escape route. Pam turned slightly, her eyes sweeping over the jury. She could see the impact of Hastings' words beginning to take root. The small shifts in posture, the furrowed brows, the way some members leaned forward as if straining to hear every syllable. Mr. Hastings, she said, her voice taking on an edge of finality, can you provide the court with any direct evidence of these claims? For a moment, Hastings hesitated, not out of uncertainty, not out of fear, but out of the deep understanding that what he was about to say would alter the course of this trial forever. Yes, he said finally, reaching into the pocket of his jacket. The room tensed as he pulled out a flash drive, the small metal object catching the light as he held it up. Every transaction, every communication, every falsified report, it's all here. The courtroom erupted. The press scrambled for their microphones, their cameras, their pens. The spectators surged forward slightly, hushed exclamations rolling through the chamber like distant thunder. Even the jury, trained to remain impassive, exchanged quick glances, the reality of the moment settling over them like a sudden storm. Judge Whitmore's face had drained of color, his fingers twitching slightly against the polished wood of his bench. He opened his mouth as if to object, as if to command order, but the words did not come. Pam turned, locking eyes with the judge for the first time since the trial had begun. There was no anger in her gaze, no satisfaction, no triumphant smirk, only certainty. This, she said, her voice carrying over the chaos, is the truth. The walls of the courtroom, once so unshakable, seemed to tremble with the weight of what had just been revealed. And though Judge Whitmore still sat behind his bench, still wore his robe, still held his gavel in his grasp, the truth had made one thing painfully clear. He was no longer in control. The courtroom, once a temple of authority where Judge Randall Whitmore's voice dictated the course of justice, now pulsed with a different kind of energy. The carefully constructed facade of law and order had begun to fracture, the weight of undeniable evidence pressing against its fragile foundation. The moment Robert Hastings lifted the small metal flash drive into the air, the very air in the room seemed to shift, no longer stagnant with the certainty of power, but charged with the inevitability of downfall. Pam Bondi, standing tall with unwavering conviction, watched as the prosecution's assistant approached the witness stand, retrieving the flash drive from Hastings' grasp with careful precision. Every movement felt deliberate, as though the very act of transferring that evidence was a ritual of justice itself. Hastings, his shoulders squared but his eyes burdened with the heaviness of truth long concealed, let out a slow breath as the digital key to Whitmore's undoing was placed securely into the hands of the court. Judge Whitmore's grip on the polished wooden bench had tightened, his fingers curling inward as though he could physically hold onto the power slipping through his grasp. His once unshakable presence, a monolith of legal dominance, now seemed smaller, a shadow cast by the looming reckoning inching ever closer. His voice, sharp and commanding just hours earlier, now teetered between forced control and unmistakable panic. "This is absurd," Whitmore spat, his voice laced with the kind of desperation only a man watching his empire crumble could possess. "Hearsay, speculation, unfounded accusations. It's all meaningless without proper legal scrutiny." Pam Bondi turned, her measured gaze locking onto him with a precision that cut deeper than any verbal rebuttal. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to mirror his unraveling composure. She simply let the evidence speak for itself. The jury, the press, the onlookers who had come to witness justice take form, all knew the truth now. And no amount of Whitmore's bluster would be enough to smother the roaring fire of accountability. "Your Honor," Pam said, her tone calm, but edged with the undeniable weight of finality. "The court will now review the contents of the flash drive." The courtroom clerk, a man who had spent decades serving under Whitmore's authority, hesitated for only a brief moment before inserting the drive into the court's computer. A screen flickered to life behind the prosecution's table, its glow casting an eerie light across the wood-paneled walls. The audience collectively leaned forward, the anticipation almost tangible as the first document appeared. A financial ledger, numbers meticulously recorded in neat columns, filled the screen. Pam stepped closer, her voice steady as she gestured toward the projection. "This is an offshore banking transaction, dated exactly 5 days before Judge Whitmore ruled in favor of a major corporate defendant. The deposit? $500,000. A murmur swept through the courtroom, like distant thunder warning of an approaching storm. The screen flickered again, revealing a series of email exchanges. "Here," Pam continued, her voice unwavering. "We have direct communication between Judge Whitmore and a lobbyist for a pharmaceutical company currently under federal investigation. In this email, Whitmore assures his contact that the case against them will not see the inside of a prison cell." The weight of those words settled over the room like a leaden curtain. Pam turned to the jury, allowing the moment to breathe before proceeding. She wanted them to absorb what they were seeing, to recognize that these weren't just accusations. They were undeniable facts, etched in digital ink, signed by the very man who had spent decades wielding a gavel in the name of justice. Judge Whitmore, his carefully curated mask of confidence beginning to shatter, exhaled sharply, shifting in his chair as though the very weight of his own misdeeds had begun crushing him from within. Pam wasn't finished. The screen shifted once more, revealing a document marked confidential, its bold lettering stretching across the page like an unsealed confession. A legal case, dismissed under Whitmore's direct order, outlining the wrongful conviction of an innocent man. A man who had served 10 years behind bars while the true perpetrators walked free. The courtroom was silent now, not out of disbelief, but out of something far heavier. The jury's expressions had transformed, no longer neutral, no longer carefully measured. There was something else now, an unmistakable shift, an anger that simmered just beneath the surface, a realization that they had been asked to serve judgment on a man who had corrupted the very foundation of the law itself. Pam inhaled slowly, her voice softer now, but no less commanding. "This," she said, gesturing toward the screen, "isn't just about bribery. It isn't just about unethical rulings or financial corruption. This is about the lives that were stolen, the families that were broken, the trust that was shattered." She turned back toward Whitmore, whose once firm posture had begun to sag under the weight of irrefutable truth. "This is about a man," she continued, "who built his empire on the backs of those who never stood chance." Whitmore's face, now ashen beneath the courtroom's fluorescent lights, twitched with barely concealed rage. For the first time, his lips parted, not to argue, not to deny, but to breathe through the suffocating realization that there would be no escape. Pam stepped back, her work done. The evidence had spoken. The truth had been laid bare. And now, the law would do what it was meant to do. Judge Whitmore was no longer the arbiter of justice. He was its defendant, and the fall of his gilded throne had only just begun. The courtroom, once ruled by the unwavering voice of Judge Randall Whitmore, had become a battlefield where truth now wielded the greatest power. The evidence, projected in damning clarity for all to see, painted a story of deception so meticulously orchestrated that its unraveling felt almost surreal. The jury sat in tense silence, their expressions dark with the weight of betrayal, their gazes fixed not on Pam Bondi, nor on the screen filled with irrefutable proof, but on the man who had once sat in judgment over countless others. Randall Whitmore had not moved since the first financial transaction was displayed. His fingers, still wrapped tightly around the edge of his bench, had begun to tremble, though whether from rage or dread, even he could not be certain. The robe, once a symbol of his dominance over the courtroom, now felt suffocating, its fabric heavier than it had ever been. His chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, the polished gavel before him suddenly meaningless in the face of the truth that now suffocated the air around him. Pam Bondi, her posture as unwavering as her resolve, allowed the silence to stretch. She knew that words, in this moment, were secondary to the weight of what had already been revealed. The audience, filled with reporters, legal scholars, and citizens who had come expecting another routine trial, sat frozen in the realization that they were witnessing history. No longer was this just a case of judicial misconduct. This was the exposure of a man who had traded the sanctity of justice for personal gain, a man who had shaped lives, decided fates, and crushed futures without a second thought. Finally, it was the defense attorney who spoke first, his voice strained, his hands tightening around the case files before him, as if they could somehow shield him from the inevitable. "Your Honor," he said, his tone more cautious now, less sure of itself. "Given the nature of these allegations, I request a recess before proceeding any further." Pam turned slightly, her gaze locking onto him with the precision of a hawk. She had anticipated this moment, expected Whitmore's counsel to grasp at any possible delay, any momentary pause that could allow them to strategize. But there was no escaping what had already been revealed, no amount of legal maneuvering that could erase the reality now burned into the minds of every person in that room. "Your Honor," she countered, her voice unwavering, "the prosecution objects to any delay in these proceedings. The defense has had ample time to prepare. The evidence is clear, the documents authenticated, and the testimony of Mr. Hastings is indisputable." She turned toward the jury, her voice steady, calm. "The American people have waited long enough for justice. We will not allow legal games to undermine what is at stake here today." A murmur of agreement rippled through the courtroom. The press leaned in further, pens poised, cameras recording every flicker of emotion on Whitmore's face. For the first time since the trial had begun, the judge did not respond. Instead, he sat frozen, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line, his gaze darting between the screen filled with evidence and the rows of spectators who now saw him for what he truly was. The power he had once wielded had evaporated, slipping through his fingers like sand, leaving behind only the inescapable reality of his crimes. The lead juror, an older woman whose face bore the lines of someone who had witnessed both hardship and resilience, cleared her throat. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, met Whitmore's without fear. "I think we've heard enough," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of the people's judgment. The court reporter paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard, waiting for the next command. The bailiffs, who had stood passively for most of the trial, shifted slightly, their postures straightening, their presence now carrying an unspoken readiness. The audience, sensing that the moment of reckoning had arrived, sat motionless, the collective breath of the room held in quiet anticipation. Pam inhaled slowly, feeling the enormity of the moment press against her, the culmination of months of relentless work, of sleepless nights spent poring over case files, of whispered conversations in dimly lit offices where witnesses had hesitated before deciding to come forward. Now, standing at the precipice of justice, she spoke the words that would seal Randall Whitmore's fate. The prosecution formally moves for the immediate removal of Judge Randall Whitmore from the bench and requests that he be placed under arrest for judicial corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to pervert the course of law. The words hung in the air like the final stroke of a hammer against steel. For a single, suspended moment, the courtroom remained eerily still, as though the walls themselves needed time to absorb what had just been declared. Then, a rustling sound, papers shifting, chairs creaking, the murmurs of journalists scrambling to document the downfall of a man who had believed himself invincible. Judge Whitmore's chest rose sharply, his breath coming in ragged bursts now, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair as if they alone could keep him tethered to what remained of his crumbling empire. His gaze, once filled with the quiet arrogance of a man who had always been in control, now flickered with something he had never allowed himself to feel: fear. The bailiffs stepped forward. Whitmore's mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came. His once commanding voice had abandoned him, leaving behind only the rasping breath of a man drowning in his own demise. Pam Bondi did not move, did not allow herself even the briefest moment of satisfaction. Justice was not about personal triumph. It was about restoring what had been stolen. She watched as Whitmore's trembling hands finally released their grip on the bench, as his shoulders slumped, as the inevitability of his fate settled upon him like an iron weight. A moment later, the bailiffs reached him. A hush fell over the room, the anticipation sharpening to a fine point. The sound of metal clicking against metal echoed against the courtroom walls. For the first time in his life, Randall Whitmore was no longer in command. For the first time in his life, he was the one in handcuffs. The cold bite of steel wrapped around Judge Randall Whitmore's wrists, a weight unlike any gavel he had ever held in his hand. The courtroom, once a stage where his word reigned absolute, now bore witness to his downfall, the final act of a man who had spent decades masquerading as the keeper of justice while secretly twisting its foundations for his own gain. The sound of the handcuffs locking into place reverberated through the chamber, not with the finality of a verdict, but with the echoes of every life he had shattered along the way. Pam Bondi stood motionless, her face impassive, her expression one of quiet certainty rather than triumph. This was not a victory to be celebrated with cheers or applause. Justice, when served correctly, was not a spectacle. It was an unshakable force, a truth that could no longer be buried beneath power, influence, or deception. The law had spoken, not in whispers behind closed doors, but in a declaration so undeniable that even the most corrupt men could not escape its reach. The jury, their duty now fulfilled, remained seated, their faces reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and vindication. Some looked down at their hands, as if still absorbing the weight of what they had just participated in, while others stared at Whitmore, no longer seeing a judge, but a man stripped of his illusions, his authority reduced to nothing more than a prisoner awaiting his fate. From the back of the courtroom, a reporter whispered to a colleague, his voice hushed but urgent. "Get the headline ready," he muttered, scribbling frantically into his notepad. Judge Whitmore, once the most feared name in the legal system, leaves his own courtroom in handcuffs. The cameras, flashing like lightning in the aftermath of a storm, captured every moment as Whitmore was pulled to his feet. His face, once lined with quiet arrogance, now bore only the hollow remnants of a man who had lost everything. His lips parted slightly, as if forming an argument, a plea, perhaps even an order, but nothing came. His voice, so used to commanding the room, had been swallowed by the crushing silence of his disgrace. Pam stepped forward, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her voice calm, yet edged with finality. "This courtroom," she said, her words filling the space like the closing lines of a long unfinished story, "is no longer a place where justice is bought and sold. Today, It has become what it was always meant to be, a place where the truth prevails, no matter how powerful the accused may be. Her gaze swept over the faces before her. The jury, the reporters, the attorneys, the onlookers who had come expecting another day of legal proceedings but had instead witnessed a reckoning long overdue. Then, finally, she looked at Whitmore, who stood with his shoulders hunched, his hands bound in chains, the weight of his own sins dragging him downward. "Your Honor," Pam said, the title now hollow in the presence of his disgrace. "You once asked others to answer for their crimes. Now, you'll answer for yours." A slow murmur rippled through the crowd, not loud enough to disrupt the solemnity of the moment, but enough to acknowledge the gravity of what had transpired. The bailiffs, their movements practiced and methodical, guided Whitmore toward the side door of the courtroom, the same door through which so many had once walked, sentenced by his hand, condemned by his words. As he moved, his feet dragged slightly, the weight of his shackles foreign to a man who had never once considered that such chains might one day be his own. He cast one final glance at the chamber around him, but there was no sympathy in the eyes that met his. No reverence, no fear, only the cold, unwavering gaze of justice staring back. Then, with the push of a heavy door, he was gone. A slow exhale seemed to pass through the room, like a collective breath held for too long, now finally released. The trial, the evidence, the testimony, it was over. What remained was the aftermath, the slow rebuilding of trust, the restoration of faith in a system that had teetered too close to collapse. Pam turned toward Robert Hastings, who still sat at the witness stand, his hands folded in his lap, his expression unreadable. For a man who had risked everything to come forward, there was no satisfaction in seeing Whitmore led away. Only the quiet relief of knowing that his silence had not endured in vain. She gave him a small nod, an unspoken acknowledgement of the cost he had paid for the truth. He returned it, his shoulders finally loosening as if the weight he had carried for so long had been lifted, if only slightly. The press swarmed outside the courthouse, their cameras already rolling, their microphones poised, ready to capture the words that would define this day in history. Pam, stepping through the heavy doors into the crisp afternoon air, was met with a barrage of questions shouted from every direction. "Ms. Bondi, did you ever doubt you'd get justice? What does this mean for the legal system going forward? Do you believe other judges are guilty of the same corruption?" She raised a hand, signaling for silence, before speaking in a voice measured but unwavering. Justice is not about personal victories. It is not about headlines or political agendas. It is about ensuring that no man, no matter how powerful, is above the law. Today, we took one step toward restoring that balance. She didn't wait for more questions. She had said all that needed to be said. As she stepped down the courthouse stairs, the weight of the moment pressing but not breaking her, she knew that this case would not be the last of its kind. There would always be those who sought to manipulate the law, to twist it into something self-serving, to believe that power could insulate them from consequences. But there would also always be people like her. People who fought, not for recognition, not for glory, but for the simple, unshakable truth that justice, no matter how long it took, would always find its way to the surface. And today, justice had spoken.